Thank you for joining us on the All Funds podcast. My name is Skyler Steinke, and today I'm joined here with our guest, Phoenix Haffen. He is the Director of Advisor Solutions at UI Charitable. He's also an expert in charitable planning and spends a lot of time working with financial advisors and high net worth families to maximize the tax efficiency and outcomes of their charitable giving. Welcome to the show, Phoenix.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Skyler.
Absolutely. Well, I'm interested to get into a lot of topics today, but maybe we'll just start with maybe a little bit of your background and kind of how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a director here at UI Charitable, coming up on the 4-year mark. So time flies.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I started more on in operations, on kind of the grant making side, client service, and then have since graduated to kind of more of a business development advisory role. And so, so that's what I do now. And a little bit of background on us as a group. So at UI Charitable, we view ourselves as a philanthropic back office. And so we spend a lot of time working with high net worth individuals and families to help them with their charitable planning. And in doing that, we're really focused on two goals, which is, are our families achieving the charitable outcomes that they care about? And then are they structuring their giving in the most tax efficient way possible? And so kind of everything we do revolves around, we view everything as those two sides of, okay, you've decided you want to do some charitable work. What are the outcomes you actually care about? And then are you doing that in the most tax efficient way possible? And so, some people hear that and they kind of scratch their heads at that and they say, philanthropy is really simple. I just give cash to a charity. And we say, no, you should never do that. Never give cash to charity. And not because you shouldn't be generous and not because you shouldn't be supporting charities, but just because cash is the least tax efficient asset that you can donate. And so, that's a big message that is very recurring in everything we do. A big part of what we do is helping people donate non-cash assets, right? And so whether that's public securities, real estate, privately held business interests. We had a donor do a pallet of silver bars. We've had a ton of different alternative investments. And so, really just anything that has that capital gain appreciation, where in donating that asset, you're avoiding the capital gain on that portion. And so, so we get all these crazy different asset types that we help people put into a charitable vehicle, but it's all in the name of tax efficiency.
Got it. Very cool. Yeah, I'm sure, like you said, I'm sure there's all types of different assets you've seen with the donations there. I'm sure crypto and Bitcoin have been on the top of the list for a while.
Yeah,
as well.
Bitcoin was huge in kind of that last bull run of Bitcoin. We had a slew of donors doing that, but
yeah. Well, that's great. So you have two sides of the fence. You obviously talking about actual charities, and maybe you can give some folks kind of just a primer on like evaluating charities, right? Because there's a lot of them out there. So maybe some good, some bad. I don't know if you can give us a little bit of a high level of that. Maybe we'll start with that.
Yeah, sure. So, like I mentioned, a lot of what we do, I would say more than less, we're focused on that giving side and the tax efficiency side of, okay, what actually makes sense to put into a donor advised fund. But some donors do come to us and say, hey, what should I be supporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, some know exactly what they want to do. They say, don't bother me. I'm just going to give to my church every year. And then some say, no, I actually want to, be more educated in this realm. And so usually those conversations start with, okay, well, what's a geography that you care about? And what is the impact area that you care about? And so, a lot of people care about their own community, but some might say, no, I care a lot about women's empowerment in sub-Saharan Africa. Or, a common one that we hear is, I care about solving homelessness in my geography, right, in my city. And so that's kind of where it starts, is kind of those two spectrums of what's the geography, what's the impact area. And then from there, as far as evaluating groups that are already doing that work, because that's kind of what you want to start with, right? Is there someone out there that's already doing this sufficiently? And one thing that I think people get really caught on is expense ratios. So that's a really common thing to look at, right, for a nonprofit. So, of their spending, how much goes to salaries of the employees doing the work, and then how much goes to the work and the operations that they're doing. And I would argue, and we would argue at UI Charitable, that you people actually ascribe too much value to the expense ratios, because what should matter is not how much is the staff being paid. What should matter is what are the outcomes of the charity, right?
What's
And
the impact?
so exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And so a lot of nonprofits come to us because we're a donor advised fund provider, and we have a lot of charitable assets that are, need to be distributed at some point. um, a lot of nonprofits come to us and will ask us for funding. And, for some of those groups, it's, can you really well articulate what is the problem that you're hoping to solve? What is your intervention? So what is your theory of change? What are you doing to specifically solve that problem? And then what are your outcomes? So on that specific problem that you're solving, how is the work that you're doing specifically changing the lives of those that you're working to benefit, right? And so,
Yeah.
for example, a lot of nonprofits, or a common example we hear is, for example, drilling wells, right? Like if you're a nonprofit group that is focused on improving human lives and you want to do that through clean water, you shouldn't go to your constituents and say, "Look at this," or to your donor base and say, "Look at this, we drilled 5 wells this year," because that doesn't tell
Right.
you anything about the work, about how the work is actually benefiting the group that you're supposed to be benefiting, right? It really should be,
Right.
because of the wells that we have drilled, X number of people now don't need to walk 4 hours a day to go get clean water. And so instead, they can receive an education, and that's improving their lives in, X, Y, and Z way. Right. And so, so that's kind of as far as the evaluating charities and charities evaluating the own work that they're doing. That's what we really point them to, is make sure you're very outcomes oriented. And you're not just talking about the work you're doing, you're talking about the actual change and the benefit to the people that you are supposed to be benefiting, right? How are you actually
Right.
creating outcomes?
Right. So what's the impact? And like you said, don't place a lot of, you know, onus on the expense ratio conversation, to your point.
Yeah, and it's important. You don't want every dollar that you're
Yeah.
giving to a charity to be going to the CEO's salary.
Right.
But I would much rather support an organization that has a high expense ratio, but is actually doing great work and achieving great outcomes, rather than a group that has a really low expense ratio, but their staff is just not that experienced and not that good and is not out actually achieving the outcomes that they're supposed to be achieving. So
Right. Yeah. Great points there. You mentioned donor advised funds. For folks, for the audience who doesn't know what a donor advised fund or a DAF is, can you kind of explain that structure?
yeah, yeah, of course. So, so a lot of what we do is donor advised funds, and we're a donor advised fund provider. And what that is a donor advised fund is essentially a charitable account. So you set up this donor advised fund. You can put assets into it, whether that's cash, public securities, privately held business interests, real estate, really any asset into the donor advised fund. While it's in there, you can invest those dollars to grow your charitable capital, or you can recommend grants out to nonprofits. And you take the tax benefit when you put those assets into the donor advised fund. And so, what a donor advised fund does for you is it separates the tax consequences of your giving from when you actually accomplish that giving, right? And so, going back to kind of what I was saying earlier about, you really want to optimize for both sides, right? Once you decide you have a charitable interest, now it's about making sure that you do that in the most tax efficient way possible, and then making sure that you achieve the charitable outcomes that you care about. And so, a donor advised fund allows you to first focus on the tax efficiency, make sure you have that figured out, get those assets into the donor advised fund, take your tax benefit. And then from there, you can really focus on, okay, how do I want to invest these dollars to grow my charitable assets? And how do I want to support the groups that are doing the work that I care about?
Okay, so yeah, so it sounds like, obviously with that process, timing is definitely a factor on when you and provide the funds or whatever, asset you have to the donor advised fund, and obviously how you want to invest it over time into whatever charity that makes sense for you, right? And it sounds like you would get something from that as a benefit up front, a tax benefit up front, and then later on
Yeah.
becomes part of the charity's assets when you pass on.
Yeah. Yeah. And to maybe just to provide a bit more of reference for what a donor advised fund is comparable to. So a lot of people, when they think charitable giving, they're thinking of a private foundation, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the vehicle that comes to mind for most people. And so a donor advised fund is very comparable to a private foundation, in that they're both charitable giving vehicles, right? You're putting
Mhm.
assets into them, taking the tax benefit up front. You now have this charitable vehicle that can grow your charitable assets tax free. The difference is going to be a private foundation is a little bit more intensive. So it's its own entity, right? So you're
Mhm.
setting up your own entity, you're staffing it. You have to distribute at least 5% of assets annually. So it's more involved. Whereas donor advised fund, you can spin it up pretty quickly. You don't have any required annual minimum payout. Um, and so it's easier to spin up and shut down. It's lower cost overall. And so for our clients, we find probably 90% of the time that a donor advised fund makes more sense. Um, there are a couple situations where you'd want to use a private foundation. If you want to make grants directly to individuals, you can't do that out of a donor advised fund. And then if you want to hire staff to manage it, you
Mhm.
also can't do that out of a donor advised fund. And so, um, we find for those really upmarket clients, if there's 8 9 figures that they want to do of charitable giving and they want to be really involved and they want to hire staff, private foundation might be the preferred route there. um, but for most individuals, a donor advised fund accomplishes what they want to do, just at less expense and less headache to set up.
So, why should fund managers care about DAFs or donor advised funds? And how should they think about raising for that next fund they're thinking about there? How they can be creative about the raise, essentially.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so, one thing that GPs should be aware of is that you can raise dollars for your fund out of charitable vehicles, right? And especially out of a donor advised fund. And so that's one thing that some DAF providers are not going to allow you to do that. They might have restrictions in their investment policy around how dollars can be invested, but we're very flexible. We have a very flexible investment policy. And so when you're out, as a GP raising for a fund and you're looking for LPs, if you have someone who's kind of on the fence, but they have charitable assets, whether that's in a private foundation or a donor advised fund, they can use those dollars to invest into your fund. That donor advised fund can actually be an LP in your fund.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Um, let's go into maybe just the what types of assets can founders contribute before an exit that many people don't realize are eligible for this framework.
Yeah. So one example that's really interesting. Probably overall, most donor advised funds are just getting public securities, right? That's probably the most common example you see
Yeah.
is, someone has Apple stock that they bought for $10, it's appreciated to $15. They have that $5 of capital gain exposure. And if they put that stock into a donor advised fund, they get a tax deduction for the full $15 fair market value. And when that stock sells within the donor advised fund, they get that full $15 to then either grant to charity or reinvest. Right. And so that's kind of, what you're doing high level when you use a donor advised fund. And so public securities is the most common example that we see of that. But for a lot of individuals, that's not their lowest cost basis asset, right? For a lot of individuals, they might have a business that they've been growing for 10 years or 15 years, and their cost basis is almost zero. So, if they have a sale, their uh, capital gains liability is almost the entire value of it, right?
Right.
And so those are great assets to donate. So we talk to a lot of founders who are, they have a sale for their business coming up in the next 1 to 6 months, and they're going to uh, donate, 2% or 5% of their business into a donor advised fund before it sells.
Awesome. Very, very cool. And then this maybe you kind of mentioned it as far as the business side of things for a company, putting that into a fund. But what is the biggest mistake people make when thinking about charitable giving before selling their company? Going into that thought process there.
Yeah, I think for a lot of founders, it's just that they are a little bit late, right? And so they've sold their business and now they're looking at their charitable giving, but they already paid taxes on the entire business, right? And so now you're using post-tax dollars to fund your charitable efforts when you could have received a larger tax deduction and had more dollars to play with if you would have done it before the sale of the business. And so, so that's something that you want to look at when a sale is on the horizon. Um, and the process for that is essentially, you get in contact with us. We figure out, okay, what exactly is the asset? How do you hold it? We draft a gift agreement, which is just the legal document that transfers the ownership from you personally into your donor advised fund.
Yep.
And then once that gift agreement is signed, that's when that ownership officially transfers into the donor advised fund. And so you just want to do that before any definitive sale documents have been signed. Because what the IRS is looking at is they want to know that the gift of that asset and the sale of that asset were two separate events, and it wasn't, predetermined that, okay, because the sale was already locked in, you donated it last minute, just to avoid the capital gains portion. So you do want those to be distinct events, the donation and the sale.
Right. And I'm assuming that through that process, you need an independent appraisal for the value. You have to figure that out as well.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So your tax benefit is based on the value of that asset on the date of donation, which is determined by a qualified third-party appraiser. And that can be done anytime from 60 days before the date of the gift or up until when you file taxes in the year you made the gift. So you kind of have that whole window where it could be done before the gift agreement or it could be done after. And so for some donors, they say, I know pretty well what the business is worth. I'll just get the gift done and I'll do the appraisal later. And
Mhm.
some say, no, this is kind of a speculative asset that I'm donating. I want to know exactly what the tax benefit is before I put it in there. And so, for some donors who are donating LP interest in a fund or something like that, that's where they're going to want to know what that value is before they for sure go through with a donation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, how does donating business interests before a transaction differ from donating cash after closing? I know you mentioned cash is the worst probably situation to be in, so maybe that's part of the answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah. So the simplest way to look at it is whatever capital gain exposure you have on that percentage that you're going to put into the donor advised fund, that's what you're saving, right? And so on that example of the public stock, the Apple stock, um, if it's $10 and it goes up to $15, you owe, 20% capital gains on that $5 of appreciation. And so that dollar is what you're saving, right? And you're
Yep.
saving it in terms of you get a larger tax deduction, but then also you still have that dollar left over to do something charitable with, right?
Yeah, makes sense. What's the craziest asset you've seen being donated to donor advice fund?
Yeah. We've seen a couple interesting examples. I mentioned we got a pallet of silver
Yeah.
bars. That was interesting. We had one donor come to us who had 4 greenhouses on rural land.
Huh.
And he said, these have been such a pain for me. I cannot sell them. I'm getting them appraised at a pretty good value, but I don't think I can actually get the appraised value out of it.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to put it into a donor advised fund, take my tax deduction, and then whatever we can actually get for it, those dollars will go to my charitable giving, and that's great. And so we see that sometimes as well, for individuals who have kind of a problem asset
Right.
and they're just looking at okay, yeah, I know I want to do some charitable giving, but really I also want to simplify my life, clean up my balance sheet. And so the greenhouses were a great example of that. Another interesting example is we have one donor who's a really big venture investor, has dozens and dozens of LP investments. And there was a couple of those that he made between 2020 and 2023 that he's saying, okay, this fund last raised when I invested in 2021, and the appraised value is really high. On paper, it's worth a lot. I think if I were to actually sell this position in a secondary sale, I'm only going to get pennies on the dollar. I'm never going to see what its paper value is.
Right.
But because that's all the information rights I have, and that was the last time they raised, if I donate it and get it appraised, I can probably tie that value pretty close to that last, the value that it was on paper when they last raised. And so for him, he was saying, if I donate these fund interests, I'm going to get a great tax deduction. And then if there ever is a liquidity event, now those dollars go into my DAF tax free, and I can do all my charitable giving out of that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's another example. And for this donor, he's really interesting too because, like I mentioned, he's huge in the venture capital space, and he's out of Silicon Valley, and so he's always looking for how he can support emerging fund managers, so those who are launching their first fund. And so, he's a lot of the time the first 25,000 or 50,000 into these fund managers who are raising their first fund. And he does all of that out of his donor advised fund.
Wow.
So he's looking at it and saying, I just want to support the venture community. I don't really care about those dollars coming back to me, but I do want to have as much money as possible to support the venture community. And so if I do this out of my donor advised fund, those investments, I can, grow those dollars tax free. And then when there's liquidity events, those dollars just come back into my DAF, and I can perpetually do that. And so it's a really interesting example because most people, when they think about philanthropy, they're thinking about giving away money, but there is actually ways to, do philanthropic things with your investing.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So I'm assuming, just obviously kind of thinking through this you're looking for a very highly appreciated asset, or you have maybe a big tax situation in that year. There's a lot of planning that goes around. This is kind of what I'm hearing. It's not a last minute decision. It's talking to your tax team and CPA to make sure, this makes sense as you go into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably, 75, 80% of our business mostly comes to us through financial advisors because they're the ones who have that, that elevated view of what their client's doing.
Yeah.
When they have liquidity events coming up, what that's going to mean for them down the line. And so they're generally the most, the best positioned to see that. So we get a lot of that. And then we also get, like you were mentioning about, what should fund managers know as they're out fundraising? We always tell them, hey, if you're having a hard time raising your fund, start bringing up the idea that you can accept charitable dollars, you can accept DAF dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so, maybe some of those LPs who are a little more risk averse, they don't want to do it with they don't want to make an investment with the dollars that are in their free and clear personal pocket. They could, if they have a donor advised fund that's just kind of laying dormant, they haven't done anything with it for a while, they can make an LP investment into your fund out of that donor advised fund. And if their current DAF provider won't do it, we will do it for you at UI Charitable.
Amazing. That's great. So is there any problem assets or that are more problematic than others people are thinking about that they should pay attention to when going into these types of funds?
Yeah, I would say so. Cash and public securities are really easy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, on everything else, all the complex assets, there's kind of a range of less to more tricky.
Yep.
Cryptocurrency technically counts as property, so it does need to be appraised,
Right.
but the whole donation process and appraisal process is really simple.
Yeah.
Private business interests like LLCs and C Corps are not too complex. And then, for example, but if you have an S corporation or an LLC taxed as an S corporation, those we can still do. We still do lots of them, but that gets a little bit trickier because those can trigger unrelated business income tax
Yeah.
when they get donated to the DAF on any income that's earned when it's held by the DAF because it's being held by a charitable entity. Um, and so, on an S corp or an LLC that's taxed as an S corp, you want to be aware of UBIT, any UBIT liability that might come up. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Um, you brought up an interesting thought about, just DAFs as a capital source for emerging managers, as a key
yeah,
audience, right? Any additional thoughts on that? Just obviously from an investor point of view, that can be interesting and from an impact point of view, but from a fund manager raising capital, that seems to be a pretty unique opportunity.
yeah. I think it's just one more angle where you can, one more thing that you can speak to and get potential LPs' minds running on, okay, I want to support you. I want to be involved in your fund. Where do I actually have the liquidity to be able to do that? And if they've got a private foundation or a donor advised fund that's just invested in public securities and they've just been growing those charitable dollars for a while, they don't have any immediate plans to grant those out to nonprofits, they can use those dollars.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I think, and what's the kind of the obviously we talked about different assets here. Who's holding these? Who's custodying these assets? I mean, you talk about Bitcoin
Yeah.
held in cold storage in a wallet somewhere. Is that something that you guys custody? Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, in all these arrangements, we're usually putting these assets into a donor advised fund,
Mhm.
and we're the donor advised fund provider in that case.
Mhm.
And then as far as where we custody, the donor advised fund's the vehicle, but there has to be a, actual custodian holding those assets.
Right.
And so, if it's public securities, we're going to hold it in whatever custodian the donor prefers, if they have a preferred custodian. If they don't, it'll typically be Schwab.
Mhm.
Um, and then, yeah, it's a great question on the Bitcoin side. You sound like know your cryptocurrency. Asking about the
Yeah,
cold
a little
storage.
bit there.
Are you a Bitcoiner at all?
I've been in Bitcoin and crypto for a long time. Actually, professionally, I got into it in 2015, but I have friends been doing it since 2012.
Oh,
So
awesome.
so both sides of the fence, personal and professional, been doing it for a long time. Obviously, I wish I would have done more back in the day, more investing in that. But yeah, definitely interesting on that side for sure.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. On the crypto side, yeah, we use a few different custodians, kind of prefers on what the donor wants
Yeah.
to do, what they care about. But yeah, for some who are more security minded, we actually have a really unique partnership with Unchained. If you're familiar with that group, they
Yes.
do multi-signature Bitcoin wallets.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so for our Bitcoin donors, we can set them up with a multi-sig wallet where they've got, we as the DAF provider hold a key, they as the donor hold a key,
Hmm.
and then Unchained as that wallet provider holds a key. And so they've got that, those multiple points of failure,
Yeah.
which, matters a lot when you have something like this cold card
Yeah.
exploit that just came up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, so there were several donors that reached out to us that said, "Hey, my key is a cold card. Are your is yours or is Unchained?" And luckily neither are.
Yeah.
And so, they have that one point of failure, but all their Bitcoin is still secure.
Yeah.
And so we're in the process of getting those vaults changed over so that we can get back to those three secure keys again.
Yeah. That's great. Anything else that you want me to kind of cover that we haven't really covered to this point?
I think we've covered everything pretty well. I mean, those are, kind of the overall,
Arching.
messages that we just hammer on
Yeah.
is yeah, don't donate cash,
Yeah.
donate your appreciated or your problem assets.
Yeah.
And then high level, yeah, I would just say that I think donor advised funds are a very tax efficient way
Mm.
to accomplish any charitable giving or any investing that you want to do in a tax efficient manner and a self-contained manner. And so there are a lot of things that you can do out of your philanthropic pocket as opposed to your personal investing pocket.
Yeah.
If those investment returns have to come back to you personally, if that's the goal, then you don't want to use a donor advised fund.
Mhm.
But if you're doing, some kind of investment for a charitable purpose, you can do it tax free out of a donor advised fund. And so, just one more example we have of that. we had a donor who came to us who said, there is an abandoned school building in my community, and it's such an eyesore. And I think I can get it for $1 million.
Hmm.
And what I want to do is buy it and turn it into a community center.
Wow.
And so, yeah, really interesting, right?
Yeah.
And so for this donor, he doesn't care about the financial returns from that project going back into his personal pocket, right? This is a passion project. He wants to enhance his community. And so he said, I'd love to do this out of my donor advice fund. I
Mhm.
have a donor advice fund at Fidelity. They'll never let me do this because they just want to keep their process as simple as possible, and this is outside of their process, and so they're never going to let me do it. We looked into it and said, yes, that's perfectly permissible by the IRS, and so that's something that we can help you do. So he transferred his staff to us, and we've now gone through we're just closing on that building now. And so so that's a really interesting example where if you don't need the dollars from that investment to come back to you personally, for this donor, he's looking at, okay, if I need to free up $1 million cash to go buy this building, I can do that out of my personal investing pocket
Mhm.
and create potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of tax liability, to sell all the public securities to free up that cash,
Right.
or I can do it out of my donor advice fund, tax free. And and so for that donor, it was a great solution.
That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. Any kind of random or interesting charities that you've seen somebody kind of donate to over the years that would nobody really
I
would
don't
know
know if I
about?
have
Or
any there.
yeah, I'm just curious. Yeah, that's kind of come up because everybody has their
Yeah.
own thought process around impact and what they want to donate to outside the asset.
Yeah, yeah. I would say I wish I had more good examples. I know we've had some
Yeah,
interesting ones. But yeah, everyone's passionate about different
yeah,
things, and we have some donors who are more or less involved, some just want to do grant making, some actually want to be doing the charitable work themselves or be really involved, like that donor who's buying the school
yeah.
building, right? Um he's not just giving money to a group so that they can do it. He actually wants to be, involved. This is his
Yeah.
initiative. Um, we have another donor. It's pretty interesting. They care a lot about economic prosperity in Tonga,
Hmm.
and in the South Pacific just at large. And we looked into it, and for what they wanted to do, we said there's not another group that's doing this well. And so they said, all right, well, what can we do? We want to increase economic prosperity in Tonga. And so we helped them set up an employment center that hires virtual workers in Tonga. And so that was one where the donor didn't quite know how to achieve that
Yeah.
outcome. And we stepped in kind of more in a consulting capacity and actually helped them get that set up. And so now there's an employment center in Tonga that's getting hiring all these remote jobs out of the U.S. And so that just got kicked off earlier this year. And so that's been kind of an interesting project we've been involved in.
Yeah, that sounds neat. That sounds really cool. Types of individuals that kind of are part of this. Obviously, you talk to a lot of financial advisors for their clients who have this planning, whether it be for their families, fund managers, maybe family offices. Anybody else that would be kind of the types of individuals that be part of this?
I think we've covered a lot of it.
Yeah,
Yeah. For financial advisors, we're looking at, okay, how can we incorporate charitable planning to help you grow your practice
right.
and have a better connection with your clients? For individuals, it's how can we help you achieve the charitable outcomes that you want,
Yeah,
and and do that tax efficiently. And then for fund managers, it's how can we help you raise your next fund?
yeah.
So
I love that. That's a great thought process for folks looking to raise capital. That was a great thought to give to managers. That's great. Well, this has been a fun conversation, Phoenix. Where can people go to find out more about you and UI Charitable?
yeah, so our site is uicharitable.org. So that's just the letters uicharitable.org.
Mhm.
And then if you go to /learn more, there's more resources. You can schedule a call with us, all of that. So that's probably the best place to go.
Amazing. Well, this has been really fascinating and appreciate your time and giving us insight about donor advised funds and what you guys do at UI Charitable. We'll make sure to put all your contact info in the show notes as well. This has been great.